Hey everybody, I'm ZombieJohnny, and today we're going to be taking a look at what is considered the first Studio Ghibli production. This is Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind is written and illustrated by Hayao Miyazaki and published by Viz Media. The story is set in a post-apocalyptic world. It is told that the world was destroyed in the 7 days of fire. Industrial civilizations were laid to waste by giant warriors. The survivors had to start the world anew. As the world was being reborn, a poisonous miasma that is produced by a toxic forest covered the world in all but small stretches of land, mainly along the coast of the ocean. There are giant insects that live within this toxic forest and get upset when the humans venture into it. Our main character, Nausicaa, seems to have the uncanny ability to communicate with not only insects, but has some sort of special ability to communicate with all walks of life. This innate ability allows Nausicaa to travel freely into the forest and study the poisonous spores and not antagonize the insects. These insects also carry the spores of the toxic forest and are spreading them and is now swallowing what little land is left. This is making the surviving colonies have civil unrest with one another. The larger kingdoms are waging war on one another over land and religious differences. Nausicaa is walking through the toxic forest and stumbles upon a giant insect shell called an omu shell. The shells of the insects are used for materials such as armors and weapons because they are so sturdy. When Nausicaa hears a rumbling in the forest, she goes to inspect. An omu is chasing someone through the forest and Nausicaa sets off a signal flare to guide the person to safety. After finding the person rushing out of the forest, Nausicaa calms the omu and returns it quietly to the forest. This person she saves is Master Yupa, an old friend of the people of the valley. Master Yupa and Nausicaa return to the Valley of the Wind and you learn about the people of the valley. That evening, a ship covered in insects crashes into the Valley of the Wind and it causes major problems for the people. First, an invading nation sets foot in the Valley of the Wind. This causes Nausicaa to go into a frenzy and challenge one of the knights of the invading army. This invading army is led by Kushana, who is one of the main characters of the story. Just so you know. I only mention her twice throughout the whole review, so there you go. Second, the ship that crashed into the valley covered in insects spread poisonous spores throughout the valley, causing many of the valley's trees and crops to be contaminated and die. Lastly, Nausicaa is sent off to war after it is declared and the valley must join the allied forces on the battlefield. And this is where the adventure begins. Though Miyazaki does have a few published works, Nausicaa seems to be one of the very few serialized manga that he has done. The art style is a little rough and almost sketch-like, meaning some of his lines aren't very true and his pen weight is very light. Wait. This manga was mainly drawn with pencil, and it has very little inking. That's probably why there aren't many varying strokes. Miyazaki's art style also has a lot of cross-hatching and tiny details, so sometimes it's kind of hard to tell what's going on. There's some shading in the panels as well, but once again the panels are filled with tiny details that don't really make the art any less dense. Speaking of the book being dense, sometimes it feels like I'm reading a novel from page to page. Some of the points of the dialogue are pretty long-winded. I know that Miyazaki's building a universe in the story, but sometimes I feel like it's a really long time before the story actually moves forward in between all of the dialogue and contextual narrative. Though it does have interesting parts, it's a bit of a slow burn. The middle section of the first book moves along at a pretty slow pace. I feel that the second book is lighter on dialogue and the story stomps along at a pretty good pace. All of the main players in the story are separated for a good chunk of it, so it keeps it fresh by jumping from plot to plot. Unlike Akira, where jumping from plot to plot is just tedious. The second book had me saying to myself, where could the story go from here? I was getting near the end of the book and it just kept guessing again and again, but I could never come to a conclusion. It seemed like things were gonna wrap up, but the story just kept going. There are a few points in the story that actually kind of shocked me. There are some intense battles and intense gore. There isn't that much graphic detail in Miyazaki films, but this is on a different level. Limbs flying, things exploding, blood everywhere. It's intense, and with his past few films being more family-friendly, it seems almost uncharacteristic of him to have made something so violent. But you can tell Miyazaki's really pouring his heart out into this manga. A lot of his writing and films seem to center around the preservation of life, especially the preservation of nature. Apparently, Miyazaki was influenced to write this story from a real-life event. Minamata is a small factory town located in the Kumamoto prefecture of Japan. In the 1950s and 60s, the Minamata Bay was polluted by wastewater mixed with mercury. The fish and shellfish in the area were contaminated and the locals were eating the fish, thus leading to Minamata disease, a severe form of mercury poisoning that caused numbness, muscle weakness, damage to the hearing and speech, and in some serious cases, insanity, paralysis, coma, and death. Miyazaki's influence came from the fish and shellfish living in this toxic environment, spreading the disease onto people. So one thing that this comic did that was interesting but not really necessary was that it included the sound effects glossary in the back of the books. It includes the translation from kanji into Japanese words, and then that is translated into English sound effects. And over the years I've seen this handled in a couple of different ways. Most translated manga would edit out the kanji and just replace it with English words. I've seen every sound effect with an asterisk beside it, and the sound effect written in English at the bottom of the page. And I've seen non-translated kanji as well. In my honest opinion, this really isn't needed. You can look and see what's happening in the panels, and the sound effects are pretty self-explanatory. So, much like Akira, there is a film based off the manga, and we can't go through this review without talking about the film. The film shares the same name, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. The film actually really only takes place in the first third of the first book. Unlike Akira, where the film is kind of scattered throughout the manga series, this film is based off just a tiny fraction of the manga. But just like Akira, there is a much larger expanded universe within the manga. The first film isn't technically a Studio Ghibli film, but it is considered a Ghibli work, and it is included in many Studio Ghibli collections as such. It was made just before the studio was founded, so it's kind of in this gray zone of being a production but not being a production. Now, there is an American edit of the film called Warriors of the Wind, and it is apparently terrible, and I really need to watch it. So from what I understand, the film cut out a bunch of parts I thought were difficult to understand, and in turn, that cut out a bunch of the key points of the movie's narrative. After this, Miyazaki made a strict no edits clause, stopping studios who were releasing Ghibli films from making any edits to the films at all. During the American production of Princess Mononoke, Miramax attempted to make some edits, and the producer of the film, Toshio Suzuki, famously sent an authentic katana to Miramax with a note attached that said no cuts. Toshio Suzuki, you sir are a total badass. Much later on, Nausicaa was picked up by Disney. It was redubbed, unedited, and glorious. Throughout the books, I noticed a lot of similarities to Miyazaki's other works. Some of the designs look similar or are almost exact replicas of his later works. I see some design elements from Howl's Moving Castle, Spirited Away, and especially Princess Mononoke. There's even an animal creature thing that looks exactly like Yakul, Ashitaka's red elk. Well, mostly. It has touches of the spirit of the forest in its deer form. As the story comes to a close, it kind of takes a weird turn. Let's just say I didn't enjoy the ending of the story as much as I enjoyed the rest of it. Some of the story dragged on, and to be honest, the last paragraph of the second book doesn't really paint a picture of what exactly happens to conclude the real story. It ends, and it's not even a happily ever after ending either. It just sort of ends. The last paragraph, I feel, is more focused on Kushana, and it paints a better picture of her future more than Nausicaa's. Isn't the story supposed to be about Nausicaa? Why does Kushana's future story really matter? And what about the fate of the other kingdoms and the other people in the story? Why were they left unsaid? Overall, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind is an interesting look into Miyazaki's ideas and work. Honestly, I had no idea that the manga even existed up until about 6 or 7 years ago. I always thought Miyazaki was just simply a filmmaker. The version I have is a giant hardcover box set that is made up of 2 books that come in a really nice case that also includes a poster. I do remember seeing smaller graphic novel-sized versions of the series a while back, and as far as I can tell, there are 7 volumes. There's also another box set consisting of 4 paperback novels. Total page count, 1104. Total volumes, 2. Total score. I really had a tough time with this. I felt that 3 was too low and 4 was almost too high, so maybe a 3.5, I guess? Thank you so much once again for watching my comic book and manga review series. This was episode number 10, so it's kind of a big milestone in this series. So the other big milestone that has come up is that I am at 94 subscribers, which is still unbelievable to me. Thank you so much for your support, and thank you so much for subscribing. If we could do it, there's only 6 more people that need to subscribe, then I'm hitting 100 subscribers, and that is just a giant milestone for me. So if you would like to, please subscribe. I have a little special event planned for when I hit 100 subscribers, so let's try and hit that. Let's get it. Anyway, the next episode is going to be covering another Studio Ghibli production and more works from Hayao Miyazaki. We'll catch you in the next episode. Peace.